Tech struggles and all. So do I just kick it off from here?
That is the beauty of it, Lindy,
Okay,
right? So we,
I
we
love
always
it.
have some type of tech issues. And hello, everyone, again. Um, Thank you for joining today's session. My name is Dida Mekici, and I'll be moderating this session today. And before we begin, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping items. So this session is being recorded, so if you don't want to be seen in the recording, feel free to turn off your webcam throughout the session. And please keep your microphones muted unless you're invited to speak. And feel free to use the chat if you have any questions, and we are more than happy to share your questions with the presenter. And the closed caption feature is enabled, so you can activate it by clicking on the Show Captions or CC Live Transcript button in the bottom toolbar. If not visible, click More to find it. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Lyndi Zavy. She will be talking about leading through uncertainty, staying grounded when everything is shifting. Linda, please take it over.
Thank you. And we're going to have some uncertainty with my second screen. We'll see how life goes today for us. But thank you so much, and thank you for having me here today. Um, you know, as a recovering HR professional, here we go, friends. I am so sorry. Okay, are we still on? You may not be able to see me. That might be our biggest struggle, but um, we're going to try it camera off for a moment. Is that okay?
Yeah,
And we'll see if
definitely.
that comes back around. Okay, so other than tech challenges, I identify as a recovering HR professional. So all of my experience in HR comes from higher education and healthcare. And about 3 years ago, I started my own consulting firm, Rivers and Roads, where I help companies with their culture, community building, and clarity through things like strategic planning and talking about things like burnout. So really passionate about the things that I get to do. I'm based in Oklahoma City. Talked about the Thunder earlier, but really excited to be here today. So let's just kind of jump right in. My goals today are to help you lead with tools that help you create steadiness during change and ambiguity, to really help you communicate clearly when answers are incomplete. There's so many times where whatever role we're in, when things are changing, maybe we know part of the story, but we don't know the whole story. And I think human nature is to try and fill in gaps that we don't know, but there are ways that we can really clearly communicate what we do know without creating anything in the middle. Help you support teams that are experiencing stress in different ways. I think that's kind of the equity lens that I look at this under is when change is happening, we experience it in different ways based on maybe our level, our past experience, maybe where we are in the communication cycle with the changes. And so we'll talk about that. Talk about ways to build trust, clarity, and momentum during uncertainty. That baseline of trust is so vital when things are shifting. And so, how can we be part of those trust building activities and be the ones to build that bridge? And then, lastly, I hope that we can identify at least one immediate action for you to take this week. So, again, I apologize. I'm hopeful my camera will get back to life here in a minute. But in the meantime, please use the chat, please use the reactions, especially in the absence of us having our faces on camera. It helps me kind of interact with you. So please feel free to jump in. But today really isn't about pretending that uncertainty is easy. I think, especially right now in this world, no matter where you're coming to us from, the list of things that feels uncertain is, to use a reference here in the United States, the list of things is as long as my CVS receipt. Um, it's really, there's so many things that feel uncertain. And when that happens, it's really easy to sort of go to maybe not our strongest things, our strongest tendencies. And it makes it really exhausting because it asks us to function without closure. So maybe you're experiencing changes in your organization or in your life in general. And we're having to make decisions while we're carrying some unanswered questions, some uncertainty. And so we have to understand that that's not easy and we have to call it what it is. But we have to learn how to move forward anyway. We have to make sure that we are still putting one foot in front of the other, showing up for our teams, for those that we love and lead, and making sure that we are filling in those gaps where we can. So, really quickly, if you would just drop a note in the chat for with one word, maybe two or three if you need it, but no more than three. Drop how uncertainty makes you feel. Just name it, name the emotion, and I'll give you all a moment. Anxious. Thank you so much for that. More anxiety, uneasy, ooh, despairing, frustrated. Absolutely. Um, I'm gonna lean into this word anxious a little bit. I think that when it comes to anxiety, I think anxiety and optimism are two emotions that I think hold hands. Both of them are looking at something that we don't know what's coming. And anxiety, we choose to look at it in a way that maybe comes at it as negative or um, feeling all those feelings versus we can choose to look at it with optimism and believe that there's a better possibility ahead of us. But anxiety, this is definitely something that I struggle with, and so I appreciate you all naming that. Unprepared, ignorant. Oh my gosh, that's one of the hardest things, right? When we don't have all the answers and people are coming to us and we don't know what those answers are. We're not able to really address them with certainty. And so all of these things make that ground underneath us feel unsteady, feeling unprepared, feeling ignorant, feeling like we're asleep at the wheel. All of those things. Thank you for sharing that. All of those uneasy feelings. And I think again, for me, when those feelings pop up, we maybe don't always react in the best way in the moment. Give me a thumbs up if you feel that way sometimes. I know that my stress management style is I like to control the controllables. And when everything feels uncontrolled, I feel a little bit I don't know, I might say unhinged, a little bit uneasy and not always at my best. So there's a lot of reasons why uncertainty is draining. Uncertainty really puts our brains on overload. When things are uncertain, again, human nature, our brains start going to what could fill in those blanks and what might that look like. And so when those variables start sort of coming up all at once, we go into overdrive and our brains start to short circuit a little bit. Um, when things are uncertain, you're always kind of looking behind each corner and wondering what's going to pop up, what's going to happen. And that creates some emotional fatigue from just always being on, always looking, that feeling of always waiting for the other shoe to drop. Like I said, I spent a lot of time in higher education and in healthcare. And in healthcare in particular, we spent some time, of course, during the pandemic, that was the ultimate constant vigilance in that I have experienced. But we went and here we go again with my screen's moving. I am so sorry, you guys. This has never happened this badly. Um, all right. Um, but we went through an acquisition and there were so many questions that were unanswered. And when that is going on, you're taking your eye off the ball of whatever it is that you're in charge of, whether it's students or administration. And in my case, it was patients. And it was really it can be dangerous sometimes when you're just emotionally fatigued. This idea of story making. One of my favorite quotes is from Joan Didion, and it says, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live." And when we don't know all the answers, we start to tell ourselves stories. And that's where all of those feelings that you named for me in the chat, the anxiety, the frustration, feeling ignorant, we start to fill in those gaps with fear. And again, I think it goes back to human nature. Our sort of bend is to go to worst case scenario. And so all of those things start to lead to relationship strain. Maybe your fuse is a little bit shorter. You're less patient. You're just sort of always on that last little bit of fumes. And then lastly, when all of this stacks together, those equity gaps widen. We start to, recognize that not everyone experiences the uncertainty in the same way, and that maybe not everyone has all the same information. So I'll give you an example of this. Like I said, when kind of early 2020s, my organization was undergoing an acquisition. And at the time, I was the chief operating officer. And so I had sort of background knowledge into what was happening. I had sort of for better or for worse, I had a front row seat to what was happening in the changes. And so then when we announced it to the company, I'd already had a couple of months of knowing and learning and hearing, but here was the rest of my team being dropped into it. And they were just in the early stages of, those stages of grief. And so, I had to kind of play catch up with them and kind of get them to where I was and remember that not everyone was in the same spot as I was. And so that came to a head again when my husband's company went through an acquisition and I was kind of talking to him about some things. He said, "You have to remember, I'm not at the table. I'm not there in the same place." And also, again, under that equity lens, different levels, different backgrounds, everybody's experiencing different things in the background of their lives that makes these changes and this uncertainty really heightened. And so looking at it that way, it's no wonder that uncertainty makes us feel all these things. It's no wonder that that ambiguity creates all of these emotions and feelings and issues. And thank you, that filling in the gaps with fear. I think that really is so true. And I think that's one thing, one piece of advice I would give in these uncertain times is one of my very favorite questions that I ask myself when I'm feeling uneasy, uncertain. What do I know to be true? What do I know to be true in this moment? So again, in the example of the acquisition, what do I know to be true? I know that this organization has our best interests at heart. They're purchasing this company. They want it to go well, and so they're going to do everything in their power to help make it go well. I know that to be true. And so when we start to fill in those gaps with truth instead of fear, it can start to create a lot of grounding. So we're going to use this next slide for a 1-2 punch really quickly. And so if you would take a moment and drop in where you see uncertainty impacting you or your team the most right now, that kind of helps give me some context. And if I break all of my technology, then I did it to myself, but I'm going to try and see if my camera will let us come back in. So bear with me for a second and drop in just a couple of, and if you feel comfortable sharing, I know this is being recorded. So if you want to leave it very vague and just drop a word or two, that would be great. But it gives me some context as to what you're facing. Okay, we're going to trust it. We're going to trust it for a moment. Okay, I got one answer. I got funding. I bet that's a lot of individuals right now. Funding, understaffed, not being filled. Tara, you're dropping in. I'm feeling a lot of um, I felt that level of ambiguity, all of those layers stacking on each other. Job security, I think everybody right now is feeling that. And all of these things, I think, especially when we get to that funding insecurity, right? Or job security, that is when sort of that reptilian brain starts to kick in. And we want to start to protect ourselves and our teams, and we just sort of shut off to everything else. And I think those are the times when that can feel the most uncertain. So thank you to those of you who felt comfortable sharing. If sharing is not in your journey right now, just be thinking in the back of your mind, sort of what is creating that uncertainty for you right now. So I want to kind of pivot us to some touchstones that you can find in these moments of ambiguity, of uncertainty. And so those three anchors that can really help ground you when everything else feels unsolid. I look at it as clarity, consistency, and care. And when we can point back to one or all of these anchors, it helps give us sort of some solid ground underneath our feet when everything else feels unsure. So, clarity, naming what is known and what's unclear. So, again, what do I know to be true? And sometimes, and I usually have a blank paper next to me, I will get a blank piece of paper and I will draw 2 lines and I will write, what do I know to be true? And I will just sort of brain dump everything that I know is true in this moment. What do I know to be true? I have a job today. My team is great. I am having a great impact on students or those that I lead, so I can write down all of those things. And then what's uncertain, what's unknown. And then that kind of helps ground you in where you might be filling in those blanks, where you might be telling yourself stories of things that are untrue. When it comes to clarity, it's prioritizing what matters most right now. Again, what's the next right thing? What's the thing that I can focus on right now? For me, when I am living in those moments of anxiety or feeling unprepared or afraid, I find myself looking like 6, 8 months in the future when really where I need to be spending my time is tomorrow, next week, 2 days from now. And so taking it, really in more of those bite-sized pieces of what's right now. And similarly, breaking those situations into the next step. I don't understand everything right now, but here's what I do know. Here's what I know that I can do next. What's the next action that I can take in this moment with what I have? And then, where possible, asking questions instead of making assumptions, instead of filling in those blanks. Again, recognizing that those that you're asking the questions of may not have the answers either. But what questions can you ask? Where can you fill in more of the things that you know versus making assumptions and jumping to the worst case scenario of 6, 8 months from now? But when certainty is unavailable, that's where clarity comes in. So when I'm feeling uncertain, where can I find clarity? The next thing that I think we can find is consistency. And this is, I think, the piece of it that is the most under your control. This is the thing that when everything else around you, like I said, is uncertain as your receipt, right? As the list of things is that long, finding consistency in the things that you can control. So following through where you say you're going to, regardless of how the uncertainty, the questions, the things keep coming up, what can I keep doing? What can I deliver on to make sure that I'm doing my part? Keeping your routines. I think this is one of the things that I found, especially in COVID when things were so uncertain and we were going through the acquisition, those routines and those day-to-day things, those things that I could control to keep that consistency for my life helped make me feel grounded and secure. When we show up reliably and as ourselves and as our best selves, that helps us keep being an anchor for others too. This is one thing I'll call myself out here. When we were going through that acquisition, I found myself living in my fear and my anxiety. And I would find myself it was a pharmacy that I was working in, and I would be running around the pharmacy and I would be just like a chicken with my head cut off. I was on warp speed. I was talking fast. I was going around like a little ping pong ball. And I realized like, that's not me being reliable. That's me looking like, okay, what's going on? What am I missing? And so I would really have to sort of ground myself and say, okay, I can show up consistently. I can be who I promise to be and deliver on that when everything else is uncertain. And again, that goes into that communicating with steadiness rather than urgency. When the ground starts shifting, when things become unclear, it feels like that fast forward pace is what we need to go for when really what we need is steadiness. And so that consistency is going to help build trust, whether it's individuals that you supervise or peers that you work with on a team. Because when sort of everything looks rocky and they can look over at you and go, well, you're still calm, you're still steady, you're still who you've always been. That help builds that trust and that camaraderie among you, and you can start to set the temperature in the room. Instead of being that thermometer, you can set the temperature and say, I am the calm in the room. And then lastly, this piece I think is maybe one of the hardest ones to do when you feel so uncertain is to extend care to others who are also feeling the same way. So it's recognizing the humanity in the change. It's recognizing that we're all in this together. And so listening without rushing to fix, especially if you're in a position of maybe you're communicating some of the changes, maybe you are on a team where changes are happening, really just being there to listen and not fix, and also not to catastrophize. I think that's a skill that we get really good at in times of uncertainty is that catastrophizing. And so instead, when we're just there to listen and not to spin, that can go a long way. Checking in on others on their capacity and their workload. How are you feeling? How are you doing? What would be helpful to you right now? I know this is one that feels sometimes like I'm feeling uncertain, I'm feeling unstable. How could I help someone else? But this is that piece where it's sort of paradoxical, where by helping someone else, you also help yourself, feel better and feel more secure. Being patient and giving grace with others when you know that things are uncertain and challenging, and that you're, giving that grace wherever you can. And then lastly, this is one that I think I've gotten myself in trouble in before. Not everyone reacts the same way you will. So, for example, my husband, when things get a little bit challenging, he gets quiet. And so my response as a raging extrovert, all of my thoughts come out into the universe. My response is, why are you mad? What's wrong? What'd I do? And it's like your stress response is very different than mine. And so recognizing that, especially those that are in leadership roles, if you see their stress responses in a way that you start to fill in those gaps with fear, they must be being quiet because there's going to be layoffs, or they're separating themselves because they're going to have to make a change in my department. Pause and ask yourself, what do I know to be true? And could it just be that this person reacts to this stress, to this environment differently than I do? So, really quickly, this is a little bit of self-reflection. So, if you are, sitting in a room with by yourself, or if you're watching this on the recording, I really want you to think of an area where uncertainty is showing up for you. And again, this is the part where if you feel comfortable dropping it into the chat, that helps give me kind of some touchstone to go back to. But think about where it's showing up for you right now. So you kind of identified some feelings and some things, but maybe is that the funding issues? Is that manifesting in team dynamics? Is it showing up in how the workload is shifting? A lot of you mentioned the budget and the resources, so maybe that's where you want to lean into. But identify where that uncertainty is showing up for you. And certainly these things can also be uncertainty in our personal lives. And everything that I just talked about also applies to that personal uncertainty. But so take a moment and just identify where that uncertainty is showing up for you. And then as you identify that uncertainty, take a moment to just think about, uh, what that looks like. I think I got too much good luck with my camera for a little bit. Okay, we're back. We're back to no camera, but we're going to stick with it. Okay. Thank you all for rolling with me today. Okay, so thank you. The quiet quitting, the team dynamics, really understanding where everyone is. Thank you, Tara, for sharing that. And so, really thinking about those three anchors that we just talked about. So, running through these questions, and I'll be happy to share these because I know this is a lot more wordy than I usually get for a slide. But what would more clarity look like? So, asking yourself, what assumptions am I making? One of the things that I do with this, an exercise that I do with this to kind of get more clarity is I do this a lot of times, maybe after a difficult interaction with someone, but certainly in a moment of things feeling unclear. Again, with that white piece of paper, it is my greatest tool. I will write out everything that I'm feeling, everything that I am sort of the assumptions that I'm making, the things that I felt. So like let's take an interaction with someone, and I will write down, I had a conversation with so and so, and this is what was said, and this is what happened, this is how I felt. And then I go back through and I take a red pen, and anything that I couldn't hear, anything that I couldn't touch, anything that I couldn't observe with my five senses, I crossed out, because those were the things where I was making assumptions, I was making leaps, I was applying my own values, my own feelings to the situation. And so, really, really kind of auditing yourself for what assumptions you're making in that situation. Um, what needs to be communicated in this situation? What can I ask for? What can I check in on? Or if I'm in a position to communicate, what would help my team or my peers feel more certain? Next, what would more consistency look like? Is there a routine I can restore, or is there a routine I can apply? So I think for me, in times of uncertainty, the first things to go are sort of those rhythms of my day, those things that help keep me grounded. So maybe it's a daily journaling practice. Maybe it's taking a walk outside and remembering that there's this whole world out there outside of this. I know when I was on campus, I would just sort of stay in my office all day long, and just getting out and taking a walk and restoring those daily routines can really be helpful. Um, and maybe checking in on where my follow through has faltered. So if I'm second guessing myself, if I'm feeling uncertain about my role, my future, the future of this department, I may be taking my finger off the pulse of a couple of things. Maybe I'm not being as diligent as I used to. And so checking in with myself and being really honest about, where do I need to follow through? Um, I love this idea of like being a reducer of chaos. Am I being that chicken with my head cut off running around? Am I creating more anxiety through my anxiety? So, where can I help reduce chaos and restore some calm? And then lastly, asking what more care would look like. Where is their support needed? Are there feelings or emotions that need to be acknowledged? This was something, again, during those kind of days of uncertainty in the pharmacy. We really had to step back and say, okay, we are changing everything here for people. For an organization where they worked, it's going to be different leadership and different processes. And so acknowledging it and calling it out and calling it up so that those things don't have to live in the dark. And then lastly, when it comes to care, what pressure can be eased? Is it pressure that you're putting on yourself? Is it pressure that you're putting on your team? Are there places where you can kind of release that pressure valve to say, hey, we're going to take it down a notch. We are going to, maybe we're going to, this is so silly, but for me, sometimes it's just swapping out my dress shoes for a pair of sneakers. Can I take a little pressure off myself? Can I take it down to where I can just have a little bit of um, less pressure, less need, less demand put on myself? So again, don't forget about yourself when it comes to that care. It's not always just for your team, but it can be for yourself to make sure that you're taking time to, I talk a lot about this when I talk about creating boundaries for your personal health. Um, I know when I was in higher education, when I was working in education, I didn't take the time to go to the doctor because I didn't take the time to like leave my office to go get in my car and drive across town and then come back. And so I had sort of some, for lack of a better term, deferred maintenance on myself. And I think in times of uncertainty, it's easy to sort of pause all of those things because you think, I don't want to be unreliable or unavailable, or, what if they are making some cuts or some changes? I want to make sure that I'm just showing that I'm 110% here. Well, guess what? If you're not taking those routine appointments, if you're not taking a walk around the building every once in a while, you're going to burn yourself out so fast, you're not going to be there on the other side of these changes. And so making sure that you're pouring into yourself and applying that care to yourself in that time. I know I've been talking for a long time. It is my dark gift to have too many words. So I want to pause here before we move to the next section. Any thoughts, questions, or anything you want to lean more into? Okay, I got a thumbs up. Thank you for the thumbs up. So I just want you to think about, based on those things, I'm gonna roll us back 1 second for, this clarity, consistency, and care. What is one action that you could take in one of those categories that would help you feel a little bit better about where you are in one of these areas? So take a moment, take a pause, maybe note it. The hardest thing about all of these things is actually applying it, right? Taking it from, especially if you're attending the full conference, you're going to have lots of opportunities to learn, and so making sure that you hardwire this expectation, this action that you're committing to make. So writing it down and saying, this is what I will do, and by when I will do it. So thank you for that. Focusing on the facts, not the assumptions. I can appreciate that for sure. So again, taking that inventory. What are the facts? What are the things that I can sense with my five senses versus what am I auto correcting? What am I auto populating in my mind? So just make sure you take a moment and note something down. Mhm. pausing before we let our brain take over. Again, it's that reptilian brain that in times of stress, it just takes over and it tells us that everything is awful and nothing is ever going to be fine and that we are just doomed. We're cooked, as the teens would say. And so making sure that you're just taking a break and saying, what stories am I telling myself? What is my brain filling in that is not actually happening? All right, so take a moment to write that down. And then lastly, I just want to wrap up by we've talked a little bit about finding solid ground, but one thing that I'm really passionate about is that you can't offer steadiness if you're on shaky ground. If you yourself are feeling uncertain, unstable, again, I don't think we've really touched on this as much, but we're living in sort of this microcosm of uncertainty. Every day it feels like the news and the economy and politics and everything is ever changing, right? And certainly the landscape of education and things are changing every day. And those things have an impact on us as humans and on us as leaders, on us as peers, as family members, all of those things. And so I have this concept that I call cheerleading from quicksand. And it's this idea that wherever you are in your life, as a leader at home, at work, in life, that you are sort of the base of this human pyramid, that you are sort of this person over here, maybe, right? You would hope that you're this person who seems very solid, very grounded, very zen, right? But maybe you're this person over here or here that looks a little bit unwieldy, right? Because here's the truth. The people that we are lifting up, the people that we're taking care of, this messy middle here, they all have their own stuff too. They have grief, they have uncertainty, they have anxiety and frustrations. And so when we are trying to lift them up, when our own foundation isn't solid, I'm here to tell you it's not possible. And so it is our job, it's our role to create certainty, to create that grounding for ourselves so that then we can lift up others. I love this person up here. They just somehow managed to just find their footing and find their way, but maybe it's at the expense of those down here. Um, all right, bear with me just 1 second. There we go. We're back. All right, so how do we stay grounded? Now, some of these things, I'm going to get to the part of the presentation that's sort of like, well, duh. We've talked about these things our whole lives. We know we need to do these things. It's applying them where the magic happens. So the first thing when you start to feel unsteady, and if you're anything like me, you sort of know it. You start to kind of feel it. Um, Maybe it's that tightness in your chest. Maybe it's that like moment before you get out of bed in the morning where it's just a little bit more hesitation than it was the day before. I'm going to ask you to pause and just really connect with yourself, with your own center, with your own strength. Take a breath. Really like truly deep breathing. I'm a big fan of finding deep breathing exercises on YouTube, really taking that time to fill your lungs with air, let it all out. And then ask yourself, what do I know to be true? And again, that for me is the most powerful question we have in our arsenal. What do I know to be true? What I know to be true right now is that I have a job to go to today. What I know to be true is that I have a team to support. What I know to be true is that I have people who are counting on me to come in and be calm and stable. And so then ask yourself what matters most right now. What matters most right now is that I show up, period. End of sentence. What matters most right now is that I put two shoes on my feet and I get to the office and that I show up, or that I become available online, however it is that you show up. And so asking what matters most right now, and then taking one clear action. And friends, sometimes that one clear action is getting out of bed, and that's okay. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that one clear action is checking in with your closest colleague to say, how can I support you today? So whatever it is that helps you feel grounded, making that next right step and taking that clear action. So again, let's just I like to take a couple of moments to make sure that we're really applying action items that are sticky and that we can do. So as we think about sort of that creating our solid ground for ourselves and for others, what is one area this week where you can create more stability? Maybe it's clarifying your expectations. I think that's one thing when things are shifting and uncertain. We feel like we know what we're supposed to be doing, but then everything changes. So checking in to clarify those expectations. Again, maybe it's checking in with a colleague. How are you feeling? How can I support you? What are you doing to feel more certain? Really that strength in numbers. Reducing urgency where possible, really finding some calm and some steadiness instead of that feeling like you're on fast forward. One of the hardest things I think to do in times of uncertainty is to ask for help. Communicating earlier to ask for support and to say, I'm feeling a little bit unsteady and I could use some support here. So checking in and asking for support. Also, if you're in a position where you lead teams, being that individual to ask people, what can I do to, how can I help you feel more stable? I know for me, the one thing that I could do to feel more stable today is to get my technology figured out today. So I'm feeling that uncertainty. So again, just lastly, when uncertainty isn't available, look for solid ground. Point to what are the things that I can control. And those are things that are typically within yourself. What are the things that I know to be true? And finding that solid ground and leaning into that where possible. And so, again, there are so many things that we are outside of our control that we don't have clarity and we don't have certainty, but we can control how we show up, how we interact, and how we support those around us. And so when certainty isn't available to you, what is? And that's that solid ground. I feel like we ran through this pretty quickly. I want to pause for a moment just for any comments, questions. I don't have a little envelope on there, but I also accept hate mail. So comments, questions, hate mail, any of the above. Tell me what questions you have.
Lindy, thank you so much for this session. I think it's so valuable, especially these times when we are dealing with so much uncertainty, considering all the things going on in the world, in our lives, in the United States, I'm sure we have audience from Europe too. I'm sure uncertainty is going there as well. So
Hmm.
it's really important to, um, have that space to reflect on reality, the facts, rather than assumptions. And that was a great reminder for all of us. And I
Hmm.
like your quote about you can't offer steadiness if you are on a shaky ground, which is
Hmm.
so true. So thank you for sharing. I have a
For sure.
question, but I'm
Yeah.
wondering first, looking at the participants to see if they have any questions before I go. And feel free to unmute yourself or use the chat. And as we are waiting, maybe I can ask
Yeah.
you, Linda. So sometimes to give a break for myself, I ignore things because it helps me to take
Hmm.
a break. I take a break from the news. I take a break from the things. And it gives me kind of like peace of mind sometimes, right? Okay.
Hmm.
But I'm also
Hmm.
thinking, I mean, I'm really curious to know what you think about ignorance because some people appreciate it, some people don't agree on with that. So it's like, what is your perception on
Yeah.
ignoring things?
Yeah. I think ignorance is bliss to a
Mhm.
point, right? So it is available to us, but I do think that sometimes we have to kind of come back up for real life. So I'm going to use your example of ignoring the news. I think that finding that balance of so I set limits for myself. I bought it's called a brick, and I bought a brick that turns off certain apps on my phone at certain times. So I'm not a good sleeper, so it is not uncommon for me to find myself awake at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. I made it physically impossible to be on social media in the middle of the night so that I can't let my brain wander and create new realities at 3 o'clock in the morning. It's not good for anybody. But I do need to be well informed about the news and what's going on around me. So I kind of give myself, I also give myself time limits on those things. So building parameters around it to where you say, okay, I know that first thing in the morning is not a good time for me to see any news or really even any social media. So I'm going to block those apps during that time. And then when I come back to them, maybe I give myself a certain amount of time. So, because I think when we turn our minds off to what's happening all the time, then we lose our finger on the pulse and we get behind. So, giving yourself some space and grace, but also just really building those boundaries around it and reminding yourself, what's healthy and what's not. I think it's really challenging with our phones that we work and play in the same place. So you might be going on to go, maybe it's to go check the social media for your workplace, for, maybe an organization that you're a part of. And then all of a sudden you're embroiled in all of this just, unrest and uncertainty, and it starts to impact you. And so really just setting boundaries around that, I find, to make sure that you're staying connected, but also being cautious. It was a really long answer to your question.
No, definitely. Thank you. Actually, I was definitely thinking about the same thing because yes, like we cannot ignore things forever, right?
Right, right.
But sometimes when we feel like, oh, it's too much, and when we feel like, at the beginning you ask us about our feelings, how do we feel about uncertainty? When I feel like those feelings start to rise, and I said, okay, maybe it's time to take a break
Hmm.
for
Hmm.
my mental health, for my overall well-being. So it's like, yeah, thank you for saying that. Yeah, thank you. And I'm looking at
Yeah.
the chat right now. It seems like we don't have any questions from the
Okay.
audience, but
Okay.
we really appreciate you, Lyndi.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank
And
you.
yeah.
Yeah,
And
thank you for having me. I'm filled with gratitude to have had the time, and thank you for your grace with technology challenges. If you want to continue the conversation, this link tree will take you to my LinkedIn. I have lots of conversations about these things every week. And then last week I also released my first book, Cheerleading from Quicksand. And so it has a really I have different sections in there for solid ground that can kind of continue this conversation if this was impactful for you. But thank you all so much for your time and for your engagement. I really appreciate it.
thank you. And please feel free to share your LinkedIn address in the chat as well.
Okay, awesome.
And in the meantime, everyone, in 15 minutes, we are going to start our next session by Vitas Karpari. So please check the schedule because we have other two concurrent sessions happening in room B and C. So please take a look at that as well. And maybe it might be a good time to take a break until we start our next session.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you all.
Thank you.